Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 74 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. And I'm going to talk about some of the closing submissions and presentations that were made today. There are 7 made today and some interesting presentations made. These are not the family representative participants, but mostly interest group participants. But in addition to that, we also heard from Lisa Banfield's lawyer, Jessica Zita, who was down from Toronto. She was supposed to present yesterday, had some travel issues, and so was first thing this morning on deck. The presentations were shorter today. There was time allotted. They didn't tell us how much time was allotted, but you can see there were about 20-minute presentations each by the participants. Starting, like I said, with Jessica Zita on behalf of Lisa Banfield. Now, just a note for a programming note in a sense, the Mass Casualty Commission is planning to proceed tomorrow, Friday, September 23rd. The hurricane is coming, Hurricane Fiona, but it looks like it's not going to land in Nova Scotia until the evening of Friday the 23rd. So, hopefully we'll be able to get the proceedings in tomorrow. There's 4 presentations tomorrow. The BC Civil Liberties Association, the Attorney General of Nova Scotia, the National Police Federation, and the Department of Justice Canada. And should be able to get those done by lunchtime or early afternoon, I would think. And so I don't see any reason now, just based on the forecast, unless that changes dramatically, but everybody's watching the forecast very closely, it would seem, and so they're tracking that and see whether there'll be any delays tomorrow. I suspect the only real consideration would be people traveling home afterwards, but I think if we can get things done in the early afternoon, that'll be fine and we'll proceed tomorrow. I think the commission would certainly, I would hope, be inclined to finish everything this week and just get the presentations done with and move on. They seem to just want to get the presentations done and move on. As I mentioned, I think on the first day of presentations, the commissioners, obviously they're listening to the presentations and the closing submissions, recommendations, but they're not asking any questions. They're not engaging any of the speakers in any back and forth, probing on certain points or anything like that, as you might expect, given the significance of making closing submissions and, the potential significance of those closing submissions turning into recommendations which are going to have to be enacted and supported by the public. So, talk about some of them. So today there was Jessica Zita presenting on behalf of Lisa Banfield. Erin Breen, lawyer, was speaking on behalf of of LEAF and the Avalon Sexual Assault Centre. Linda McDonald and Jean Sarson were speaking on behalf of Feminists Against Femicide. Brian Carter spoke on behalf of the RCMP Veterans Association of Nova Scotia. Charles Thompson spoke on behalf of the Truro Police. And Blair Hagen and Rod Gilkaka spoke on behalf of different firearms advocacy organizations. And then finally, Joanna Birnbaum spoke on behalf of the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control. So the gun control issues, those were both virtual in the afternoon. Everything else was in person in the morning. So Jessica Zita was really interesting. I was waiting to hear exactly how she was going to present this. I thought it was interesting that it was her presenting with limited experience and exposure rather than James Lockyer, the more well-known lawyer who's the lead lawyer for Lisa Banfield. Didn't think that it was important enough to come down and make presentations himself, so sent an associate along. But Ms. Zita did a fine job. I'm not saying anything about that, but just the perception that the commission isn't important enough perhaps to have the lead lawyer, the big name lawyer at least, come down and speak. So like I said, it was about 20 minutes. Started off with, this was interesting I thought. Now, she started off by saying that Ms. Banfield has asked me to start off by expressing and I was waiting for her to say sympathy, remorse, some sort of, feelings for the family and the victims, but no. Express gratitude to her sisters, to her other supporters, the many people who've contacted her with supportive messages, and to the Mass Casualty Commission itself for its trauma-informed approach and its kindness to her. So that was interesting. So started by thanking her supporters, not sympathy for others. I was wondering, does she think that sympathy might somehow imply acceptance of some degree of blame, which she does not. I'm going to come to that in a moment too. So what Ms. Zita said is that their position is that the police failed Nova Scotians, and not just at the time of the shootings themselves, but prior to that, and urged some sort of educational recommendation for education on coercive control, recognizing how to deal with it for police. She talked about the criminal charges that were laid against Ms. Banfield. Now, I agree with just about everything that Ms. Zita said about this part. The criminal charges, which were a minor charge of supplying ammunition, the police came out and said right away they didn't think that Ms. Banfield knew about or supported what Wortman was doing. But these criminal charges of supplying ammunition re-victimized Ms. Banfield. This was after 8 months of, in her mind at least, cooperation with the police, and her feeling that the police misled Miss Banfield, that the police, it wasn't just sort of the lower level officers that were investigating this. This went up to Chief Superintendent Chris Leather, who was involved in the discussions, and there was a deceptive practice, and certainly in breach of Miss Banfield's charter rights. I watched some of the videos, read the statements. Never was she given her charter rights in an appropriate manner for somebody that was, or should have been at least, considered a suspect in some form, at least early on. But there were unanswered questions throughout. But she was never treated as a suspect in the true sense, where you would give someone the rights and advise them that they're under investigation, and then investigate them, and then everything they say can and will be used against them. So what Ms. Zita says is that this practice, or this, in this particularly high-profile case, this is going to have the effect of discouraging other victims from coming forward, and I agree with that. This was inappropriate. So she called the investigation both careless and calculated. That Staff Sergeant Vardy, who was doing the statements early on, was very supportive, very kind to Miss Banfield, and, but was certainly in the back of his mind, at least, doing an investigation without telling her so. And then how Miss Banfield volunteered to do the reenactments. Miss Zita says now without her sisters present, or without her support network, in other words, present, and that she fully cooperated, and that, against perhaps her own interest, fully cooperated up until the point of the criminal charges. And then once the criminal charges were dealt with, then she fully cooperated again. So based on that, and just the volume of her statements and the content of her statements, Ms. Zita says that her evidence, Ms. Banfield's evidence, should be supported and accepted fully. She went on further to say, and this is where I think I part ways with Ms. Zita, is that she bears no responsibility for what took place, but she feels haunted by it. Okay. Limited responsibility, certainly, but she knew that Wortman had this fake police car. She knew, she was best positioned to know, that he had these illegal firearms, that he had a lot of guns, a lot of ammunition, and that he was deteriorating mentally over the course of the early course of the pandemic. So no responsibility is taking it a little too far, I think, in this case. What Ms. Zita says is that the police should treat all domestic violence cases as potential homicides and investigate them with that in mind. And if that was the case, we would be here having a different conversation. So that was her presentation. Didn't get into great detail, which you can't do in 20 minutes anyway. But like I say, completely denied any responsibility. Put it back on the police. So certainly she will have, she has some civil claim thoughts in mind as she's making these claims, but this is what she wants the commission to accept. I don't much doubt that the commission will accept most or all of what Ms. Banfield has offered, just given their treatment of her to date. She wasn't cross-examined, treated with in the most trauma-informed manner one might expect, or one might, I don't know about expect, but one could imagine. Okay, so that was Miss Banfield's lawyer. I spent more time on that than probably some of the other presentations, but that seemed the most significant one. Although probably I think the better presentation was the next one, which was from Erin Breen from Leaf and Avalon. Miss Breen, I think, has distinguished herself in her limited appearances in the commission. She went through some of Wortman's history, how as a child he was subjected to abuse throughout his childhood. As an adult, assaulted his father, was a violent individual. That he had this coercive control discussion. Well, he convinced Lisa Banfield to work for him, controlled her finances, he abused his position of trust with clients, presented himself as a wealthy, university-educated professional. In fact, was able to fool, in Miss Breen's submission, Constable Wiley into thinking that he was pro-police. And then, in the weeks prior to April 18th and 19th, 2020, his mental health was deteriorating. He had bottomed out, and then the violence started. So this was really the first concerted effort, in my mind anyway, to systematically try to link together the domestic violence side to what actually happened with the violence. So I thought Ms. Breen did a good job of sort of establishing that foundation, at least, which others have just sort of glossed over and made sort of more conclusory statements instead of doing the work to be thorough and build a case. Now, the other point that I thought Ms. Breen made very well was about cross-border smuggling. We've heard about this, and she was talking in privilege terms about Wortman, but this was, she says, a tangible privilege provided by the government Canada, which was his Nexus pass. How did he get this? He got this in 2015. And so he was able to cross the border as a low-risk, trusted individual. But in 2010, the Halifax Police responded to a firearms complaint where Wortman had threatened his father, and then entered on the police database Firearms Incident Police, or a FIP. And so that FIP was on the database for 5 years. So up to June of 2015. Well, Wortman got his Nexus in March of 2015. The entry should have still been on there. The Firearms Interest Police, should have still been in the database, and probably was. But Nexus, the border police or border services didn't have access to that database. And so that would have told them that Wortman was not a low risk. And it's kind of unbelievable that this national database that the police can access would be available, but that, issues of cross-border security wouldn't be connected to that somehow in an application to make you a trusted cross-border traveler. So as a recommendation, they want to make Avalon and Leaf recommend an end to the pro-arrest, pro-conviction approach to domestic violence and the ban on restorative justice. Restorative justice is available for almost all sort of minor cases. Many, even serious cases it's available. It's used more in sort of, non-violent first offender kind of cases. It's not used in domestic violence cases, and that's a policy throughout Nova Scotia. And they say that it should be available, that treatment is often better and it can resolve the issue rather than looking for convictions, which in the first place discourages people from reporting, and in the second place it doesn't solve the problem. It just makes it worse in some ways because people have to go through the criminal justice system. They get bitter instead of learning the error of their ways and getting counseling, and so it doesn't improve things. I think that's a good recommendation. And the next one was the Feminists Against Femicide, which sounded like a radical title, and they use kind of not radical language, but stronger language than others have used. That's Linda McDonald and Jean Sarson, talking about, misogyny needs to be noted throughout the Mass Casualty report. Recommends that femicide be a separate criminal offense. That domestic violence be considered non-state torture. So that's probably taking things a little further than I think most people are ready to accept, but that was their recommendation as well. So that was that group. Brian Carter from the RCMP Veterans Association of Nova Scotia. We've heard him a few times in the discussion of police paraphernalia. Was the first time we saw him, and he was out again a few weeks ago. But with the respect to the police uniforms, the red surge, the ceremonial stuff, he says, that don't take that away from retired officers, was his plea. That's valued, and it's good for officers' mental health to still have that connection to the force after they've spent so much time, their whole career doing that. He was talking about policing in Nova Scotia, the structure of policing, and it was interesting because what he in the end came around to, he was talking about how expensive it would be to establish your own force, but then he was urging the commission to adopt the model that's used in Quebec and in Finland, which are sort of national police forces. Quebec's provincial, but consider a national force in a sense, and that's the better model, and it has different tiers based on population, about how things are done, and it's, more training up front before you become an officer, and so all these good things. So it seemed to be that he was going in the direction of saying, well, you need to replace the RCMP with that model, rather than a U.S. style model where, each jurisdiction is different. Each jurisdiction has its own different, resourcing level and capabilities, that you want some uniformity and predictability around the jurisdiction. So it seemed like he was talking about a provincial police force, but then he comes out at the end and says, he's worried about political thinking and, the political pressure might affect the decision about policing in Nova Scotia and, have the province do something foolish like remove the RCMP. Well, anyway, I'm not sure that all lined up as well as he may have thought it did, but that was his submission. The next one was the Truro Police, represented by Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson from Birchall McDougall, which is also the firm where Steve Topshee and Linda Hupman practice, who are representing the Oliver Tuck family. So I don't think anybody else or any other law firms in the Mass Casualty Commission are representing more than one client. So maybe not a direct conflict, but I thought that was unusual to see Mr. Thompson representing the Truro Police, but it was just for the closing submission, so maybe not so much of an issue. His submission on their behalf was that they were ready, willing, and able. They had 12 to 15 officers ready to go seize the new RCMP leadership in Nova Scotia as a new opportunity to reset the relationship. So that's a positive indication from the Truro Police. Issues of cost recovery for specialized services are going to have to be ironed out. And the Truro Police are recommending that the Mass Casualty Commission recommend a change to the policing model in Nova Scotia that would have regional forces policing different areas, perhaps based on the, there's health zones, economic development zones. There's lots of zones in Nova Scotia that have been established for other purposes. He didn't put it this way, but that would probably be the thinking there. Now, so after the afternoon, it was the Firearms people. First, it was Blair Hogan and Rod Gilkaka talking about how firearms are not really the issue here. He had no legal guns. That is, Wortman had no legal guns. And Gilkaka said that the Fishers, he gave that as an example, the only ones to in their home survive a direct encounter with the gunman, and they had a gun themselves. Now, as he, I think, fairly mentioned, there's no evidence that Wortman would have known that Fisher had a gun, that Adam Fisher had a gun, or that he had it ready to shoot, but he did. And so in their sense, that made things safer, that an armed homeowner was safer than an unarmed one. Joanna Birnbaum for the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control, which was formed after the Polytechnique massacre, said that mass shootings are less frequent in countries with strict gun laws. Talked about how in 2012 the government stopped tracking who owns firearms. And so she encouraged that there be more tracking of guns in Canada. She said how there's really no effective cooperation with the United States in terms of gun tracking. And she urged what she called a public health approach to firearms. Well, what does that mean? Well, in her submission, it meant lots more data and rigorous regulations. So I know the earlier speakers would dispute all of that. So we'll see what the commission does with those recommendations. Firearms access and all that stuff, in a sense, really wasn't central in other than the cross-border issue, which I thought Erin Breen covered quite well, and the Nexus pass, which really wasn't explored that much in the commission proceedings, was the bigger issue. Now, like I said, tomorrow it'll be the BC Civil Liberties Association, Department of Justice Nova Scotia, National Police Federation, and Department of Justice Canada. So I'll wait to hear what they have to say. It'll be interesting submissions. Particularly, actually, I'm waiting to hear what the provincial government of Nova Scotia has to say. They have the responsibility of policing in Nova Scotia. What do they think should happen now? That's going to be a big question that hasn't even been, it's only been hinted at through DOJ officials, nothing on an official position from the DOJ. So we'll see about that. Until then, okay, went a little long today. There was 7 presentations, though, and some important ones, so lots to cover. Tomorrow will be the last daily issue of the Rogers Brief, but we'll talk about how that may continue afterwards. So encourage people to watch tomorrow morning to see what the governments have to say. Everybody stay safe, batten down the hatches and all that good stuff. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.